Good evening. Let's meet together in Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18, which is a really interesting chapter for a couple of reasons. It is a chapter that has to do with the progression of Israel on their way to Mount Sinai, where they will be given their law. It's a really imperative chapter in that way, if nothing else. It's important for another reason, because it's so fitting, I think, for our culture today. At first glance, we might not see it, but in a little more careful evaluation, it seems to me that it's very appropriate for us to think about it because of the demands placed upon us by our own choices, because of the culture we're in, and I wonder if you've ever felt overwhelmed. And if you've ever felt overwhelmed, I mean, there's a lot of good information that can be extracted from Exodus chapter 18. So in that way alone, it's healthy for us to think about. Let's, by way of really quick review, talk about where we are. We're in this section leading up, as we said, to Mount Sinai and the giving of the law, particularly the Ten Commandments. En route to that location, we've noticed several movements of Israel, and we've seen them. They get the water from the rock. We've seen them be fed with manna. When we get to chapter 18, we have several situations that arise. We looked at the first, which was the reunion of Moses with his family, and arguably the reason we read about that in the first place is to introduce us to a man, reintroduce us rather, to the man Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. We move from there to a section of chapter 18, beginning of verse 7, where there is a rejoicing in what I believe to be a mutual faith between Moses and between Jethro. And we talked about his joy, and we talked about how much the text goes out of its way to emphasize the joy that these two men are experiencing together in their spiritual relationship. Now, beginning at verse 13, we're introduced to a little nuance that I will submit to us is a reality of freedom. There's something interesting that's taking place. And remember, we're literally within countable days from the time that these people left Egypt. And we begin to see something that's under the current, that's under the surface, that's kind of running through the entire Exodus process. Holdover things perhaps from the past. There's some other things going on, and there seems to be this constant inquiry made by the people to Moses. And it becomes quite the burden, which is where we will begin here in just a moment. Let's bow together, though. Thank you, Father, for your wisdom and for your word. Thank you for your grace and your mercy. Thank you for working together through that grace and through your truth to provide to us the book that we need to guide our minds and our hearts. We pray we'll study your word with an appetite to be filled, that we'll apply that knowledge in every day of our lives so we can serve you better in this place. Please go with us now as we study this amazing book. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Realities of freedom. We take it for granted, perhaps. Perhaps it's abused. Perhaps it is freedom that causes people to feel they are entitled to get on another's nerves. Freedom. It comes with some costs. Here we have a situation. If you look at verse 13, you see Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood before Moses from morning till evening. This is an all-day affair. An all-day affair involving multiple people in the presence of one man. The text says that Moses' father-in-law saw what Moses did for the people, and he asked him this question. What is this thing that you're doing for the people? What are you doing? Why is this happening in this way? He points out to him that this is a recipe for exhaustion. He says, you sit alone. And all the people stand before you from morning until evening. Now there's some emphasis, I think, that we need to kind of picture this. The text is rather explicit about the situation. Moses is sitting in some forum, and before him is a line of people waiting to come and address some concern. And it would appear that line is sufficient enough to last all day long. But the process is, whenever you are in the court, I guess we would say, you stood all day. This is going to lead everybody to be worn out. Somebody read, please, verses 15 and 16. I've talked about this with you several times as we've gone through this book. There's situations in this book where I'm drawn to Moses. And I see Moses, the man, and it intrigues me. Here I'm perhaps as sympathetic with him as any place else in the entire text. I want you to notice an interesting phraseology that's used. Moses gives the explanation, almost as though to say, dear father-in-law, you don't really understand what's happening. So let me explain to you what's occurring. The people come to me. Okay, that word needs to penetrate your mind for just a moment. They come to me to inquire of God. And then he says, when they have a difficulty, they come to me. All right, so instantly we're seeing something. Well, wouldn't we go to Moses? Well, of course we would. Of course we would. He's the prophet leader. He's the one who has been communicating individually with God in such a way that, well, he knows what's going on. He's the leader of the group. But then it goes further. He says, when they have a difficulty. Now stop right there for just a minute. What's this mental image that's been painted for us in the book of Exodus? When they have a difficulty? It's not like this is happening, once every 4 months. This is apparently always happening. Why are these people on each other's nerves so much? Have you ever come out of the text and asked that question? Why are they having so many difficulties? Now, it would seem to be that a lot of this is interpersonal things. Maybe it's property. Maybe it's something from the past. Maybe it's holdovers from Egypt. Maybe it's questions that were once before a court in Egypt that, throughout the process of slavery, it just wasn't settled. And perhaps the rest of the book of Exodus kind of tells us what some of these difficulties were. But having said that, boy, it sure seems to me that they're having an awful lot of difficulty. Could it be that freedom is a difficult thing to comprehend? Could it be that when people are left to their own devices and wisdom and opportunities, and could it be that sometimes that causes problems? Well, probably to ask is to answer, but when the people have a problem, he says, when they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another. I have to resolve this problem. It was your ox. You need to repay the goat. I resolved the problem. I settled the dispute. And I make known the statutes of God and His laws. All right, did Moses just say anything wrong or anything incorrect? Was anything he just said incorrect? Not a word. The people come to me. They come to me when they have a difficulty. They have a legitimate need. Now look at the positions that he's filling. I, he says, am their judge, and I am their prophet. And if we read anything out of that other than this overwhelming sense of burdened responsibility on the part of Moses, I would submit that we've misread it. Can you imagine the burden? If every person in this assembly this Sunday had a problem and lined up to talk to you. That's just what? Less than 300 people. Would you enjoy that? Day after day, 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 after... It's horrible, Sandy says. Isn't it? I've never had that difficulty with my children, but I get it. Problem after problem after problem after problem after problem. It becomes a burden, right? It becomes a burden that'll lay on you. But I'm their judge. And furthermore, I'm their only access to the statutes of God. If I don't tell them what's right, and I don't help them resolve, don't you see what's going to happen? What a responsibility. What a burden. To me, that's the man. B, is your hand up? I'm sorry, I was just trying to tell. Right. There's going to be a whole series of adjustments, right? So we're back to this state of confusion, right? That's freedom born and coming to bear upon one man. I think that's fair to say. What happens after this is this suggestion that reorganization is in order. You know, you could really take a really big parenthetical thought and step out of this text for just a minute and get really to the end of it and understand that in God's wisdom, it was predetermined before Moses ever went to Egypt that he and Jethro would meet at this time, at this place, at this very few days from the giving of the law. There is nothing unbiblical about that principle, because it certainly seems that the timing is perfect to help expedite this transition, to help expedite this settling of the people together into a common thought. Here's what Jethro does that to me is almost shocking. He gives an honest assessment of the situation. You learn a lot about these two men in verse 17. You learn a lot about them. Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. The man who just told you, I'm the judge and prophet of Israel by God's determination. And in walks someone literally out of the blue, right? Hasn't been through any of the plagues, hasn't been on the way with them, a complete outsider who, at least as far as we can tell, hasn't been there very long, looks at him and says, this is not good. Now here's what I have to do. I have to put myself in Moses' shoes. How do I take that? All right. On the count of 3, everybody who likes being told you're doing something wrong, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. And there's not one of us who is a judge of Israel. There is not one of us who is an inspired spokesman from God. Not one of us do. Now, do you think Moses enjoyed that? Do you think Moses was real? I'm glad to hear you say that. I think that would be to make a myth out of the text. But this honest evaluation, this is not good. We learn a ton about both these men. For Jethro to walk in here and say, all right, let's look at this. And for Moses not to say, it's about time you head back to Midian, isn't it? What I'm kind of trying to plant in your mind, that this is perhaps the kind of difficulty that was happening all the way along the pathway that led them through the wilderness. These, what's good, what's right, what's wrong, this constant little undertone running through that. It's not good. So he gives him a suggestion. The suggestion is basically you need to reorient yourself. All right, so remember, the only image we have of Moses so far is sitting in front of the people. He's sitting in front of them. Well, Jethro says, this isn't good. You and the people are wearing yourselves out. This is too much for you. And then he very diplomatically says, listen now to my voice and I will give you counsel and God will be with you. An implied assertion that do this with God's authority, but I think you'll find this helpful to you. Reorient yourself. Verse 19. Instead of sitting before the people, you stand before God. It is an intentional change of posture and position in the text. You're no longer going to be sitting in front of the people. You can't see yourself as the one who sits in front of people. You need to see yourself as the individual who stands before God. He's been there before, hasn't he? Oh, you kind of segue us right into the next chapter because a very interesting thing's getting ready to happen. But yeah, exactly. Stand before God for the people. Don't stand in front of the people. You stand before God for the people. Oh, you go about teaching them. Teach them the statutes and the laws and show them the way that they must walk and the work that they must do. But Moses, what you have to do is the hardest thing for anyone in a position of leadership to do. Oh, what was that again?
Delegate.
You need to delegate. You need to delegate. You need to turn this over. Because you can't stand before God whenever you're sitting in front of the people. This should ring very familiar because if you take Acts chapter 7 and kind of lay it up in this situation with the Grecian widows, You take that situation, you line it up. Some of the terminology is even the same. But he says, Moses, what you need to do is you need to learn something here, pal. You're not going to be a judge and a prophet very long. Nobody can keep up with this pace. So you find some people who are qualified, and the qualifications are listed very, very well. You shall select from the people able men. Those who fear God, who are men of truth, who hate covetousness. You need to place them equally distributed among the people. This every levels of society. This term, I don't believe is necessarily mathematically rigid. This put them over rulers of hundreds and fifties and tens. I just believe it's saying you make them accessible to the people at all levels. You make them accessible, and they're accessible at all times. And if there's a great matter, they can bring it to you. They can work it through their system, and if it's a small thing, they take care of it. And here's the beauty of it. Verse 23, there's going to be satisfaction for this. Not only is this easier for you, but if you do this thing and God so commands it, then you will be able to endure. Now, for the first time, we got a glimpse of what a haggard expression Moses must have had on his face throughout this process. You will be able to endure, to see this through. And all of the people will go to their place, how? In peace. How had they been lined up in front of Moses? In strife, perhaps? How long did they stay in strife until Moses had an opportunity to see them? Was he going to get on the docket that day? Who knows? How long was this? You see how this is going? You see, there's some interesting undertones that run through this, but through delegation, he's going to learn the process. And we read verse 24 through the end of the chapter, he makes application of this. Now, don't be misled. He didn't do that right now. This was a long and lengthy process that's described for us in some detail in the book of Deuteronomy. This involved all the people of Israel. It involved a selection of men. It took quite a long time for this to get organized. But the seeds are planted right here. And it came from one guy who was willing to listen to the counsel of someone else. That's artful. And the reality is, no one didn't benefit from that conversation that took place between Jethro and Moses. And it's quite possible that was by design. One last note about this. Moses, it says, let his father-in-law go in verse 27. He went his way to his own land. There is nothing in that to suggest this was anything but a joyous departure. It's kind of phrased by most translators in such a way to say, well, he just let him go because, well, I don't want you around causing that kind of trouble. That's a distortion to the text. There's nothing to indicate this was not anything more than a joyous, let's go serve the Lord, you in Midian, me with Israel here in the wilderness. Yes, Sandy? Great points. Sandy basically says, there is a mutual respect and credibility that exists between these two men, and that does not happen without some investment by both parties over a period of time. And Exodus has told us, whenever it would seem, when Moses was living and working for him, what a great example it is. In not only our families, but also congregational things in the workplace. This is real life know-how. You thought John Maxwell came up with this stuff, didn't you? Nope. Right out of the Bible. Delegate, 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 delegate. You stand before God. Interesting chapter that is not here by accident. The Bible was not written haphazardly. Everything in that account is designed to get us exactly where chapter 19 takes us. There is something in the mind and the atmosphere of Israel that is hindering God's ability to do with them what He wants to do. But aren't you sympathetic toward Moses? He had a heavy responsibility and he knew it. And then aren't you thankful that Jethro comes along and helps him out? Well, if you're not, you should be. Because that was a momentous occasion in the life of, I would say, two great men. Anything further from chapter 18? Yes, Bart. What a powerful and interesting point. Yeah. Very, very true. The use of a human spokesman that God uses, instead of arguably doing what he could do, hey, Moses, let's have a talk. Very good point. Consistent with the rest of the Bible. Very good. Charlie.
I can't help but think that the father-in-law who raised a woman of quality suitable to be Moses' wife, she needed him. And by placing the responsibility of teaching the children, the people took up too much of this time. Father, the daughter of Moses. I just think he's human.
You think he's human. Thank you. What a great point. Yes. Moses is human. So is Jethro. The two work together here for the better good of an entire spiritual nation. It's a fantastic point. Everything changes. What I've presented to you is what I believe is a fourfold division of the book of Exodus. This is the final. Chapter 19, verse 1, I believe, is a divisive point that begins a change of interaction now between the people and the Lord. What that is to say to us is everything we read prior to chapter 19 really is an introduction. And it's difficult to look at the book that way. But in essence, that's everything it's designed to do, is bring us to this point where now the shift goes to the people that Moses has brought out and their successive generations. Let's see what we can do with this in the time that remains. We're going to read about a covenant with the Lord. A covenant with the Lord. Now, the chapter begins, like so many of these chapters in the book of Exodus, with these subtle but powerful reminders of something we've read already. This one comes in verse 2. Israel departs from Rephidim. They come to the wilderness of Sinai. They camp in the wilderness. It says, so Israel camped there before the mountain. I would encourage you to describe right there in the margin, chapter 3, verse number 12. This is nothing short than a fulfilled prophetic statement that God made to Moses before Moses ever went to Egypt. Where God says, you, Moses, will come back to this mountain, and you, plural, with those people who you bring out will serve me at this location. That's a very neat way for the inspired document to tie together a book. Because what we see here is a very purposeful prediction come now to fruition. And you could think that Moses is now going to be, oh yeah, things are, yeah, this is exactly, now things make, you see him kind of processing information as he goes through this. Now as we move along, beginning of verse 3, there's going to be some stipulations upon this covenant. There's a thorough identification of the parties involved. Yahweh, Jehovah, God, and Israel, the people, the nation. It's going to be really clearly laid out. I, you, I, you, I, you. It's very consistent. But I want to point out verse 3 to you, because though it doesn't read that way to us, my understanding of the people who do know these languages is that this is perhaps one of the most beautiful verses in the book of Exodus. Chapter 3 is poetry in Scripture. It doesn't necessarily read that way. It is a synonymous parallelism. But if you and I could speak Hebrew, I can't. If we could read it and we could speak it, it's almost a song. Because in its two parallel expressions, it subdivides into two parallel expressions. The first pair, 10 syllables each, followed by a pause of 2 syllables translated in this text as saying, and then 2 more pairs of 7 syllables. I point that out because the Bible is a beautiful book. It is quite arguably the most beautiful piece of literature that this world, it has to be, that will ever be seen or known. It's worth pointing out. In a text that we read this verse and we're like, well, Moses went up to God and the Lord called him up to the mountain saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the nation of Israel. And we read it like, well, that's just introductory material to get us to this next section. And that's not. That's God's way of putting into the text this memorable, rhythmic, beautiful way to give to a group of people, most of whom can't read, a way to remember this beautiful, magnificent event. And isn't it interesting that the Bible is probably the only book that can teach us something without teaching us something? The wisdom of God on display. But what is the emphasis here? There's this exercise called up-downs. See, I see some people grinning who know what an up-down is. Not an exercise most people just enjoy. And, just picture me, I'm not going to do it, going face down to the ground, jumping up, just picture that over and over and over again. That's exactly what happens in the rest of this chapter. Moses goes up, Moses goes down, Moses goes up, Moses goes down, Moses goes up, Moses goes down. And you see it over and over and over and over again. Why? Why? Why such a graphic emphasis on Moses going up and then coming down and going up and then coming down? Why? Okay, very good. It's repetitious to remind, but to remind of what? With whom is this covenant to be made? It is not with Moses. The Lord takes deliberate effort to make sure that the people understand Moses isn't the guy speaking. He's furthermore going to the length to make sure that the people understand that Moses is the way that they communicate with him. It is a deliberate attempt by God to put an exclamation point on the fact that we're kind of guilty of this ourselves. The law of Moses, it's a biblical term, but it's not the law of Moses. It's the law of God. Moses went up, Moses went down. Moses went up, Moses went down. The text begins with this summary. Here's what I want you to tell the people. I want you to tell them of my power. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. Those are the plagues going to the death of the firstborn chapter. The crossing of the Red Sea. They were to be reminded of his protection. How I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That verse makes me want to be a songwriter. I didn't bring you out of Egypt. I didn't bring you into the wilderness. I brought you to me. And the beautiful image described is this: I bore you on eagle's wings. Probably not the eagles we know, but probably a similar majestic bird that would bear its youth on its wings. But the idea here is ownership, of protection, of care. I fed you. I gave you water to drink. I protected you from these enemies. I've taken care of you. Boy, just wish we could pause here for a couple hours. The power of God and the protection of God are themes that he uses to offer this grand proposition, with the implication that the power and protection of God is enough to cause everyone to submit to these prospective stipulations. Verse 5. Now, all right, remember what I did to you. Remember what I did for you. Remember how I took care of you and what I displayed to you. You remember all of that. But now, all that's over. It's still valid. It's still important. But now, therefore, and then the biggest word in the Bible, if. Now you got to drink that up. If. Now reflect back everything God has done for them is preliminary to this word, if. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure, quoted by Peter in 1 Peter 2, verse 9. To me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Oh, God puts himself on display now. I am above all the earth. All the earth is mine. There is no other God. It is I, and I am. And if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my chosen treasure among all of those peoples. And this takes us precisely to at least an ancillary point that Bart made just a moment ago. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You are going to be a representative through whom people come to me. You are going to provide information that allows people to understand holiness. You're going to represent and define everything that I wish for you to be, but only if you keep my covenant. That's more, by the way, than the Ten Commandments. The people make this affirmation. We'll finish this section out. Moses calls for the elders, and he tells them everything that the Lord has commanded him. And it says something very intriguing in verse 8. All of the people answered. It's not just the elders now. There's been a change. The elders have gone back and reported to the people, and now all of the people, seemingly in unison or at least in one accord, say together, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. Pop quiz, how long did that last? Not very long. It's a very impressive statement, isn't it? It would be so much more impressive if they actually agreed to their claim to this covenant. But nestled in between there, and probably, I think, because God knew that they were not going to keep this commandment, at least in the first generation, there's this confirmation, again, emphasis placed on Moses. God says to him, behold, in verse 9, behold, I come to you in the thick cloud, that people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. It's almost as though God sees through that. We're going to do everything you say. And with his mind toward others, says, I'm going to make sure people understand who Moses is. He is my spokesman. He is my lawgiver. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. Well, the rest of this chapter is all about sanctification. 4 times that word's used. And I encourage us to think about sanctification in preparation for what comes ahead. It's all the time that we have. I'd welcome any thoughts or comments that you have. Then let's finish before the bell. One, really? Go ahead.
God's teachings always presented in such a way that all the people can understand, not just a select few. He made sure that they understood his requirements. And the examples given were examples that they could identify with and see in their mind and picture what he was talking about. And it was always as though saying, okay, the ball is in your court. You know what I want. Now this is it. So you pick it up and run with it, or there will be consequences.
Very good. The ball is always in the court of humanity, and God always communicates his will in an understandable way, which is a really good way to think about the next few verses. But very well stated and very, very appropriate. Thank you very much.